I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Yesterday, we talked to Isaac Seumalo, Steelers offensive guard, and he answered some interesting questions about Arthur Smith, the new offensive coordinator. I want to talk about how that's going to impact the offensive line and what got said that could be a very good sign for the direction the offense is headed. That and a lot more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel, make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. All right, Steelers fans, let's get into it. OTAs resumed Tuesday, which means we were in the Steelers locker room. We'll get to some locker room footage we have with Isaac Seumalo. There's only 2 more weeks of OTAs, and then we'll have mini camp, and then the Steelers will take their break until training camp. So we will keep you up to date with all the things there. But also want to put out this news point here. If you saw this or if you didn't, here's something that happened in the NFL. There is a proposal. It's not finalized, but a proposal to change how the OTAs schedule works for the NFL. To clarify this, the NFL might move both OTAs and Steelers and NFL mini camps to start in mid to late June and serve as a ramp-up period up until training camp and make it one streamlined process instead of having OTAs and mini camp in mid to late May to early June, taking a month and a half off and then reporting to training camp. That the idea is to help players, that this could help players health-wise if they have a build-up period instead of a cool-down period from working on football and working with their trainers and being in the facility and doing official football activities. The idea is that this could help that off. But I personally think that this would cause some interesting rifts because this would also eliminate the time where people can spend during the off season not doing things about football. Like, for example, if this was to start in mid to late June, anyone that works in football is never going to, or, like media members or people that just cover teams, they're not going to see their kids because you're going to be working around the year up until the NFL draft. And then your kids get out in early to mid June. And then you're back at the facility doing all the things. And the same thing kind of goes for some of the players, right? Because if they're reporting to camp, what will be like 2 months beforehand, I think this could run into a lot of things here. It's not a finalized process, but I have certainly some serious questions about how the changing of this could take away important summertime that people usually take as time off to be with their family when they're being around football. But that's just a news point there. Let's get into what Isaac Seumalo was talking about. I do think that there's some interesting things that he brought up here. And we don't get to often hear from Isaac Seumalo. I thought he had some good tidbits on offensive coordinator Arthur Smith. Here's Isaac Seumalo in the Steelers locker room on Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched, we've watched a lot of Atlanta film from last year, and, even when he was with Tennessee, and obviously, he likes to run the ball, which I'm not complaining. Biggest thing for me is winning. That's all I really care about. If we got to run it 50 times, you got to throw it 50 times. I'll do whatever. I don't care.
Does it feel different with Zach at center, or how would you describe him as a guy in that position?
He's still a rookie, and it's coming along. Obviously, it's coming along quickly because of how talented he is. I will say Nate's been doing a great job. So it'll be a fun competition for both of them. They're both, whoever shows up, I know will be, able to help us a lot.
Isaac, what's Arthur brought from attention to detail, those type of intangibles?
Yeah, I just think he's, made everybody super accountable, which, I think starts with the players, but it's good to have it from the coaches as well. You know, I think he's been consistent in his message. You know, wants guys to, you know, take each day as it comes and, you know, be a pro and come in with an attitude of like, you know, what can I do today to improve myself and help my teammates and, you know, get this thing going towards, you know, week one and training camp and stuff.
Has it been well received?
I think so. I think you know, him with the new guys at QB and you know, the new coaches and receiving room has all been meshing really, really well. Obviously, it's, you know, end of May, so it's, you know, hard to tell that kind of stuff. But everybody's doing the right thing and working hard, and yeah, man, it's been all good.
How have Russ and Justin been from leadership or those type of snaps?
Yeah, it's been great. Obviously, you know, Russ has a huge pedigree, so there's no denying that. And then Justin has played a lot of good football, even last year, you know, probably his best season with Chicago. So they both bring unique tools and, you know, talents. And, you know, the biggest thing I think that's been for them is to, you know, be receptive and, you know, just one of the guys and, you know, holding everybody accountable while we, you know, hold them accountable, because at the end of the day, man, it's going to take somebody at that quarterback position to, you know, win a lot of games for us.
So a few things there from Isaac Seumalo. One, you hear from him continue to emphasize that the run game is going to be very important. The run emphasis continues to be there. We've heard this now from multiple offensive linemen. It is a key factor in what the Steelers are trying to do and what Arthur Smith wants to see moving forward. And there are a lot of people excited about that being a thing. So that's the first thing. Two, accountability is important, because the Steelers holding players accountable, you know, pushing, especially on the offensive side of the ball, there's more minutia that they can be accountable for. I think that's important. But I think the really big thing here is the consistency part that he talks about with Arthur Smith. I think that that last part's the biggest and most important thing here, because the Steelers, more than anything else, they need less chaos in their preparation. And it seems like that's kind of been part of the issues of the past, and that hasn't been an issue in OTAs. The whole thing here, like we've been saying for months, the Steelers needed a reset on offense. They needed not just a talent reset, but a leadership reset, an approach reset, and that would mean wiping out old problems while setting a new foundation, and that allows you to build forward with this season and beyond. And a big part of that building forward is kind of setting this tone now of like, hey, this is what I expect. This is what we're going to consistently hit, get more successes that way, and start building naturally in that format. I think that's what the Steelers, you know, want to do with Arthur Smith in this offense. It's what they want to reset. At least that's what they're trying to see. I think that's what Isaac Seumalo is kind of pointing out here, which again, I think is a very good thing for the Steelers, is that that they're approaching this situation. Now, where this consistency comes into play, can it help the offensive line, you know, be one of the more consistent groups on the team and one of the more consistent groups in the NFL? All those things still need to be shown. But the question is, when should this consistency start to show for the offensive line, especially with two rookies that you're presuming are going to be starting at some point this year, and a second-year player in Broderick Jones, and an offensive line that has been very up and down over the past few years? We'll get to all of that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, I want to remind you, this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. It's playoff time in the NBA and the NHL, and baseball is also in full swing, which means that this is the best time for FanDuel for FanDuel to be the place that you go to place a bet on every game. Right now, new customers can get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 or more bet. That's $150 to use on point spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and take advantage of this offer today. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon for new customers to get $150 back in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins, and that's from FanDuel's, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here. I want to get back to something that Isaac Seumalo mentioned that I actually couldn't include in the clip because the sound wasn't great when he was talking at this point. But he talked about it taking time for this offensive line to gel together and how that's going to be something that's really important, especially with the rookies, to make things happen. And that's a very realistic thing there. That's going to take time for this group to come together, because not only do young offensive linemen need to adjust to the speed of the NFL, to the talent of the NFL, but they also need to adjust to how they fit in a spot with 4 other professionals in the NFL, and while calculating all of that. And that's something that can be a real challenge for young players as they're figuring things out, is trying to fit in a spot in an offensive line while also trying to prove that they deserve to be in that spot in the first place. So for an example, let's go back to the latest iteration of when the Steelers took time to build an offensive line. And of course, that started way back in the early 2010s. They drafted Maurkice, Pouncey, and then they drafted Marcus Gilbert, and they drafted David DeCastro, and that kind of set the tone for things. But let's go back to see, when did that group really start to come together to make a dominant run game for the Steelers? And that was with, guys like Le'Veon Bell, D'Angelo Williams, and those guys that kind of came around. So there were, if we go back to when this group was first formated, the 3 offensive linemen we're talking about here, in 2012, Pouncey was in his 3rd year in the NFL. Gilbert was in his 2nd year in the NFL. And DeCastro was a rookie, I believe. The run game finished 26th that year. Nothing remarkable. Still middle of the bottom of the pack. And then it was 25th in 2013, which was Bell's rookie season. And so there was not a whole lot of progress there, but it eventually jumped up to 16th best in the 16th best rushing attack in 2014 and 15, and then eventually got to 14th in rushing in 2016, and that was the highest ranking of rushing that we saw during that era there. And that was also the last season the Steelers have won playoff games. So I think that there's an interesting tie in there. Last year, the Steelers were able to officially reach 13th in rushing yards overall. And again, that's only with, turning things around for the final 10 games of the season, when they started Broderick Jones, and they were the 2nd best running team in the NFL during that span. But it's still something to take account for there. And so now you got to ask yourself questions. How will the pace of this offensive lines how will the pace of offensive lines apply to this current group here? I think it's important to go over a few things as far as a comparison and the differences between how the Steelers built their last line and this line, and not just the simple part where they you could say like, oh well, they just emphasized different positions and tackles versus interior guys. A little bit deeper than that I want to go here, but let's go over a few points of comparison. One, you go back to the early 2010s and those offenses. Those offenses were still all based in Ben Roethlisberger and eventually at Antonio Brown, and how those two were just unstoppable. And so running the ball didn't need to be a priority because they already had guys that were that dangerous. And then 2, even with a struggling center in Mason Cole and James Daniels last year, the Steelers still finished, ranking higher in rushing yards than any time going back to 2016. In their ground game rankings. So I think that's certainly a good sign that if the Steelers just upgraded 2 important positions on the offensive line, that they'll be in a position where the Steelers can say like, hey, we're making the right kind of progress, and there's no need to slow that down. I know some people are going to probably point out like, well, yards per carry wasn't as high as overall yards, Chris. So what are you doing there? Well, yes, they were a bit lower in the 2016 season, or last season, excuse me. They were 19th in yards per carry. But that's still the highest the Steelers have ranked in yards per carry since also that 2016 season that we kind of keep going back to which is also again the last time that this team won playoff games. And you picking up what I'm putting down there. I am bringing that up for a reason, and I'll keep going because I think that there's a chance for this team to win playoff games this year with the way that they could potentially run the ball. If this offensive line makes that kind of progress that we saw that we've seen before with Broderick Jones, with both Troy Fautanu and Zach Frazier. And all of these guys are supposed to be game changers, not just good players, game changers. If that could be this, if that could all happen, this could end up being the best offensive line group that we've seen in a long time for the Steelers. And it's way too early to tell and to say definitely that's going to happen. So do not think that that's what I'm saying. That, oh yeah, they're just going to be that and that and that's that. But there is certainly a platform for I think for the Steelers to get to kind of keep building on what they've been doing, and to kind of keep things going. And while acknowledging like, hey, there are game changers on this offensive line, still drawing attention to their skill players who play a big role in all of that. But again, for all of any of this to happen, the offense needs to have a consistent plan from its offensive coordinator that aims to make them an offense that wants to win by running the football and then playing off of it in the first place. And that's where Arthur Smith appears to be that guy and is connecting with players who and I think that they need these players to buy in, but it seems like he's connecting with those with the players in the right way. And I think that can only be a good sign for the Steelers is the fact that he's doing that at this point of the season. But again, just kind of going back through this, there are a lot of comparisons that I think can really work. I think that if you compare this year's offensive line with the potential that it has on the roster already, there's a chance that these guys can come together and do something special on the offensive line this year. There's also a chance that it takes some time. And if it does take some time, I think it's okay, but it's not the end of the world because there's still a lot of other things going on for the Steelers. And I want to get to some of those other things here with a mailbag question that we will get to right after this break here. And I think it all kind of ties back to, players we've mentioned here. There's certainly the guys that we talked about, but guys like Najee Harris and also Pat Freiermutha will get a question on them and whether or not the Steelers' approach to how this whole thing has just been backwards from the start. We'll get to that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here. Again, I wanted to just compare in the last segment, talking about offensive lines. It took until 2016 for that offensive line to really be strong. Well, I mean, they were strong, but to be a dominant, run blocking group, and that went away shortly after that. This group, I think, has the potential to be that right away. And I think that's where things can get really interesting for the Steelers. As far as how they're building moving forward. But let's get into some of the other talk that happened here now. This one starts with a call from our Locked On Steelers call-in line, which, by the way, you can always call. Leave a call the number 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you on the show here. But there's a lot to always check for here because you guys give a lot of great questions. So I wanted to highlight this question that I thought would bring up some interesting debate here on or at least, well, I guess it's a monologue because I'm not really debating anyone, but it made me think through some things that I thought, I've kind of ignored for a bit, but I think that it's important to always kind of check yourself and just see, hey, does this still make sense? But without further ado, here's Greg's question.
Hey, Chris. Greg from Annapolis, Maryland calling here. We often hear when we talk about Najee that he'll come through when the line gets better. Past running backs have gotten better when the line has gotten better. But doesn't this signal that the rebuild was a little bit botched? I know the retirement of Pouncey and DeCastro was a bit unexpected, but taking Najee and Freiermutha at a time when the line was in flux makes it feel like Najee was put behind the eight ball from the start. What are your feelings on that and how that impacted Najee's fifth-year option? Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It's a great question. By the way, Greg from Annapolis, Maryland there. Steelers Nation is everywhere with the questions. We always appreciate everyone who reaches out to the Locked On Steelers call-in line. Again, it's 412-223-6644. So let's get into this. First of all, this is not an unreasonable question because it's one that I think has plenty of layers to it to peel back, and it also can lead to several different directions based off of your opinion and how you assess how these players have done. But let's also remember at this time, and Greg even kind of pointed this out, the Steelers thought that their offensive line for the most part would be back, that like David DeCastro would still be there. I think Pouncey was gone at this point. I may be mistaken there. I may be misremembering that. But when the Steelers drafted Najee Harris and Pat Freiermutha, I think that they thought David DeCastro was going to be on the team, and it just turned out he wouldn't be, and that kind of, I think, would have changed some of the plans there. But again, I think there's reason to hope that there could have been a leader out of David DeCastro, and that's losing that guy wasn't just losing a good player; it was losing a guy that was like the closest thing they had to Alan Faneca for years. So that wasn't just like they thought they had the dude on the offensive line, which is why they passed up on offensive line to go get playmakers early on. But I also think it also dates back to I think that people when they do this comparison, why didn't they draft Creed Humphrey in the first round? That's one of the things that always gets brought up. Why didn't they draft Creed Humphrey over Najee Harris? That was such a bust of a move. But the question shouldn't be about the first round pick. It should be about the second round pick for Creed Humphrey, because that's ultimately where he was taken late in the second round. There were 5 offensive linemen picked before the Steelers picked, and then there were 9 picked by other teams before Creed Humphrey was selected in the second round. It was not a given that Creed Humphrey was going to work out. And in fact, a lot of those players that were picked in the second round between the Steelers pick of Najee Harris and the pick of Pat Freiermuth before Creed Humphrey went after went 2 picks after Pat Freiermuth got selected. Actually not 2 picks, excuse me. It was more like 7 picks, but late in the second round, excuse me. But you look at the offensive linemen, the 9 offensive linemen that came before Creed Humphrey. Landon Dickerson's probably the one that was like, okay, yeah, that guy's doing a pretty good job, but he had injury histories coming out of college. People weren't sure about that. Tevin Jenkins has had injury problems in the NFL. Liam Eichenberg has been okay, so has Walter Little. Jackson Carman can't get on the field. Aaron Brooks has been Samuel Cosby, Dylan Radins, I think, has actually done a decent job. Josh Myers, improving there. There's a lot of different things to work through there when I look at the Steelers and the offensive line, and how would you have bolstered it at the time? And let's take a Creed Humphrey out of the equation. Because I think everyone says, oh, he's the center, they should have drafted him at the center. No one thought that he was going to be guy. That's why, that's why he wasn't picked by the NFL twice. So, it took pretty much all teams passing up on him twice before the Chiefs selected him late in the in the second round. I think that's part of the thing here, is that the Steelers are kind of adjusting to that. But, I think that there's also an acknowledgement that, Greg, to get back to your question here, I was going over the players and the offensive linemen there. Out of those 9 offensive linemen pick, I think the only one that made the biggest difference was Landon Dickerson. I think he's a high quality player, but again, his injury was something to take into concern here. And then look at the other guys. You mentioned that these were botched picks. I don't think that they were botched, and I think that these guys actually contributed important, roles into several of the Steelers' wins over the past few years. And to look at that, I look back at over the last three seasons to see if these picks were actually botched, and how both Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth contributed to the Steelers over the teams. And we start with the rookie seasons in 2021. I think it's important to remember that Najee Harris had 1,667 yards from scrimmage. That's the most by any Steelers rookie ever. And I mean, that's like more by a lot than Franco Harris or Le'Veon Bell. So I think that's and when I say by a lot, I mean by like more than 400 yards more than those guys. So I think Najee Harris, again, he still has to work on quite a few things, but I think that in 2021 he was definitely worth the draft pick then, because that kind of really worked out for for the Steelers. And without Najee Harris's efforts, they missed the playoffs that year. And I think not as essential as Harris was, but I think Pat Freiermuth was certainly a big part of that. He had touchdowns in game-saving situations and 2 key wins against the Browns and the Bears in close games. And I do wonder if the Steelers would have made the playoffs without Pat Freiermuth, and I'm not sure that they would have. So there's that too. In 2022, both of their second years in the NFL, Najee Harris had less yards, but was still pivotal at least 4 of the Steelers' 9 wins that season. Freiermuth got more yards, but less points, over 60 yards in 3 wins last season. I think that's certainly something to note there. And then finally in 2023, if you're looking at, again, if you're asking yourself, were these picks botched? Najee Harris had 6 really good games that the Steelers won last year. The Titans game, the Packers game, both Bengals games, the Seahawks game, and the last Ravens game, all were in, I believe, Najee Harris's favor as far as, like, you know, how he performed against them. And Freiermuth wasn't as big. Again, Najee Harris has been that guy who's been very impactful for the Steelers for years. But, you know, Freiermuth, I think, you know, with his limited position and limited things that he could do at tight end, he does what he can. And he was huge in 2 games last season, both against the Raiders and the Bengals, where he had a touchdown in the Raiders game that was really important. Might have had 2, I think. But then, and the, you know, in the Bengals game, the first game, when he went ballistic for like 122 receiving yards or something like that. And then in the second Bengals game, when he was just a complete decoy that the Steelers were using to kind of fool the Panthers in that game. So he's had plenty of important moments, even though his important moments will stack up as high as Najee Harris so far. But if you're on the side that, hey, you would have rather seen the Steelers stink and sink and get high draft picks during that time, I think you got to note, if that happens, you probably wouldn't have been able to re-sign guys like TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Minkah Fitzpatrick to big deals that are going to keep the team competitive for quite some time. And I think that's a mistake that I think that's a mistake that when you go back and you look at how the Steelers could have built through this, they would lose these key players. Sure, they get high draft picks, but this rebuild would now take a lot longer than it already has. And to me, that's why I don't believe in tanking, unless you're already there. Like if you're already in a place where it's just, there's nothing that can happen to you here, I get it. But like, look at the players that the Steelers are attracting, even now, where they still haven't won a playoff game yet. You've got guys like Patrick Queen, who recently just said publicly, he's like, hey, I took less money to come to the Steelers because he thinks they can win right now. Like that's a real thing. And it's an important, it's important for the Steelers to have that kind of appeal. And I think that there are players who still see the Steelers as that kind of appeal, to saying like, hey, even if not everything's lined up, like Tomlin's going to make us a competitor. And if we can get in that tournament, we can get in that dance, we can be a competitor. So again, I think Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth lived up, at least I think they have done part of their share of the bargain. Now, as far as the 5th-year option, I think it's just because the Steelers understand that the running market is tough and that they're trying to not overspend on it. And so I think that's they're going to try to do today. But I look at what the Steelers offer, as far as what they could do this year. And yes, I agree. It would have been nice to have an offensive line, but you took who was best available to you. And both of these guys have contributed to multiple key wins that have kept the Steelers in the playoff hunt the past few years. I think that with a better offensive line and a better coordinator, both of these guys, and what I think will also be better quarterback play, I think both of these guys will flourish, get big numbers, and you're going to see a whole different situation for how the Steelers kind of handle, when they're trying to put offenses together, when they're trying to build, and again, setting that foundation for the offense to reset from what it was last year, bringing this back to Isaac Seumalo's talking about consistency. If that is a consistency can be maintained, that's the key. That's how you become a great offensive line, because then you see consistency in your program, you expect consistency, you give consistency, and then eventually the offense starts to click. And then the playmakers that we're talking about were botched picks are in good places. And yeah, sure, it stinks for Najee Harris that he didn't get his 5th-year option. Again, I think that can come back to bite the Steelers if he ends up being more expensive because he has a big year and he finally has everything lined up for him. But yeah, so all that to say, Greg, I don't think that these guys are botched picks just yet. Now, if they have middling to meh years this year, and they're if this isn't a year we see that, I think that then we could start to revisit were these botched picks. But I think with 1 year left on their rookie deals, to see how this happens this year, who knows? Maybe there'll be a re-signing in training camp. But I feel like there's more to this that needs to be kind of be talked about when we're looking at how these 2 younger players have worked before we call them busts or botches or anything like that. To answer your question for now, would it be better? Would it be great to have that offensive line fixed? Sure, but I think that's what they're doing right now, and I think that it's put the Steelers in an interesting position here for how to expect them to play this first year with new, as Isaac Seumalo said at the top of the show, new offensive coordinator, new coaches, lots of new younger players, new system. All this is going to be stuff learning on the fly and learning as we go. But we're happy to learn with you here and explain what we're learning from our insights here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read more work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. Find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, breaking down your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on again, your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Thanks again for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow after another visit with Steelers OTAs in the Steelers locker room right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.